the message spread.
Peter was a changed man, but he had a long way to go before he could prove he was capable of fulfilling the role that Jesus had assigned him. And his continued authority wasn't guaranteed. There were other figures contending for the leadership. The path ahead was fraught with difficulties. Paul, a radical newcomer to the movement, was a zealous and passionate convert. He wanted Christianity to spread beyond Israel to the whole of the Mediterranean. Paul wanted to preach to non-Jews, Gentiles. Then there was James, the brother of Jesus, who wanted only Jews in the movement. According to Paul's letters, Peter was the man in the middle, sharing the missionary work with both James and Paul. But the underlying message in the letters is clear. The actual leader of the early church was not Peter, as tradition supposes, but James.
What's so interesting is Paul complains that Peter had acted properly toward Gentile Christians, but when men from James came, Peter felt intimidated and began to be aloof from the Gentile Christians. That tells me that James exercised the authority and Peter deferred to it.
The split between James and Paul presented Peter with a unique opportunity. The conflict could easily have destroyed the early church. Instead of taking sides, Peter journeyed throughout the Mediterranean, preaching to Gentiles and Jews alike. It was a crucial decision. The more he traveled, the more his authority in the Christian communities grew. But the real test of Peter's leadership was to come in Rome, capital of the empire.
As the saying from antiquity goes, all roads lead to Rome. That's true. Another way of saying it, though, is all roads come out of Rome. And that was done deliberately. The Roman legions could march on those roads and get to any part of the empire quickly. Well, if the Christian gospel took root in Rome and became strong, and there were many Jewish people and many synagogues in Rome, this could then become a power base, a platform for the early church to launch out from and spread throughout the Roman Empire. So it makes good sense to see Peter, Paul, and others desiring to go to Rome and establish the church there.
The apocryphal texts say that Peter took his family to Rome with him, a sign that he intended to stay there for good.
That's corroborated by 1 Corinthians in chapter 9, where Paul mentions that Peter takes his wife around with him. In fact, Paul says, it's me and Barnabas alone that are really the exception to the rule. It's like all the apostles take their wives with them in the ministry.
There's even evidence in the catacombs that Peter's family were with him in Rome. One of the frescoes at Santa Domitilla shows the figure of a martyr, Petronella, who some believe was Peter's daughter.
We have here a picture of the deceased, a lady called Veneranda, and next to her we have St. Petronella, often associated in legend with the daughter of Peter, from whom we have certain records from the 2nd century. And what is happening in the fresco is that Petronella is actually leading Veneranda into paradise. Interestingly, the fresco is also illustrated with a satchel of scrolls of the law. Now this perhaps suggests the traditional linking of Petronella with St. Peter, because many of the frescoes of Peter and Paul show the same theme of the scrolls of the law.
To establish himself as leader of Rome's Christian community, Peter had to have credibility. If the people believed he could cure the sick, that would make his job easier.
Claims to have a connection to divinity had to be backed up because such claims were so numerous. You had to deliver the goods, you had to do the deeds in addition to preaching the message.
But Peter's bid to establish a Christian church in Rome was challenged by a magician who, through mass hypnosis or sleight of hand, persuaded the crowds that he too had supernatural powers.
In the interim, a figure known from other sources named Simon Magus arrives in Rome. And Simon Magus makes some astounding claims, but he's very convincing. He claims to be a divinity himself, and he proves his claim by flying through midair, unassisted. This turns many of the new Christians away from the faith, and they start to follow Simon instead, because they're completely convinced by his demonstration of divine power. It's this situation to which Peter is called.
Simon Magus is the arch enemy of Peter. It's kind of like the Joker to Batman. And Simon Magus kind of steps into the void and becomes the new leader. And other than just a small handful of faithful Christians, the whole church goes over to Simon Magus.
The apocryphal Acts of Peter say that after a series of confrontations, Peter and Simon Magus end up in a duel. The Acts describe the final scene where Simon Magus tricks the crowd into believing he is levitating above the Roman skyline. Peter has to stop him.
Peter sees that Simon is actually being held aloft by demons. And so Peter's response to this is to make a prayer against the demons in the name of Jesus Christ. The demons become afraid. They drop Simon Magus. He falls on the ground and breaks his leg in 4 pieces. And then he goes off to get medical attention, and the doctor botches the job and he dies. And that's how Peter disposes of Simon Magus.
It's impossible, 2,000 years later, to determine exactly what the duel entailed. But we do know from other first-century sources like the writings of Eusebius and Irenaeus that Simon Magus really did exist. As for the magic, this was very much a part of the fabric of first-century belief and practice.
Well, Jesus is presented as doing things like this too. Jesus walks on the waters, it seemed kind of levitation. Jesus exorcises spirits. Jesus raises people from the dead. Jesus cures cripples and paralytics and so on. These are all part of magic in those days. So, I mean, I don't accept that the Jesus character did these things. But clearly Simon Magus was pretending to do things like that. That's why he's called the magician.
There is no independent confirmation of Peter's victory over Simon Magus, but there are signs he is likely to have been victorious. We know from another 2nd century historian, Tertullian, that Peter began to baptize his converts in the Tiber River, in the heart of Rome.
When Tertullian is describing the practice of baptism, he says that normally it is conducted in living water, that is in flowing water. As he says, John baptized in the Jordan and Peter baptized in the Tiber. So clearly, as far as Tertullian is concerned, and I think it's historically true, Peter was remembered for having baptized in the Tiber River.
But success came at a price. Peter's teachings challenged Roman morality. The more pagans he converted to Christianity, the more he jeopardized his chances of staying alive. Peter's doctrines of strict Jewish practice dictated that sex for pleasure was a sin. It was even frowned on within marriage, and then only permissible for procreation.
The Acts of Peter have this position on marriage and sexual relations that they simply shouldn't happen. And that's what gets Peter into trouble, that he preaches to the wives of powerful men to desist from having relations with their husbands. They're, of course, supposed to remain married, but not engage in conjugal relationships.
Not surprisingly, Peter upset 2 Roman senators. They had him incarcerated in the Tullian prison on the Mamertine Hill, along with his old friend Paul. But according to tradition, faith had a hand in their release.
When Paul and Peter were locked up together, they managed to convert 2 of their guards and a number of others, whom they baptized in the prison using water from a fountain, which, so the tradition says, had miraculously appeared in its floor. Now, whether that tradition is historically accurate or not is one question, but clearly it does fit very nicely into what I take to be historically correct, and that is that when Peter was in Rome, he baptized converts.
Peter may have been released by his converted guards, but even though he was free again, his troubles were far from over.
Peter and Paul picked a bad time to be in Rome in the 60s. This is when Nero, the last of the Julian Caesars, was in his worst time of insanity. And he was fearing conspiracies against his life. He was absolutely crazy. And he used Christians as scapegoats, especially when rumors were floating about that he was the cause of the fire that burned down 1/2 of the city of Rome. So he blamed the Christians.
Nero began an unprecedented and horrific campaign of persecution. The Acts of Peter tell of his terrible dilemma. He could stay in the city with his fellow Christians and die, or leave to fight another day. A situation not unlike the one he faced on the night of Jesus' arrest in the high priest's courtyard. Now, with those instincts for self-preservation surfacing again, Peter made a tactical decision to leave the city. Perhaps he reasoned that he would be of more use to the church alive than dead. Along the Appian Way is the Quo Vadis Church. It's dedicated to an account in the Acts of Peter, which gives us a valuable insight into how Peter finally assumed leadership of the early church.
These are the ancient flagstones of the Via Appia. About 4 miles down here, we get to the gates of Rome. If you wanted to get out of Rome in a hurry, this was a good road to take. Peter donned a disguise and then walked along this road to make his escape from the city. And as he was walking along this road, somewhere around this spot, the tradition says that he met the Lord coming from this direction into Rome. And when he came to Jesus, he said, "Quo vadis, Domine? Where are you going, Lord?" And Jesus said to him, "I'm going into Rome to be crucified again." So Peter turned around, made his way back into the city through the gates, and going back in to face his awful death.
No one can tell whether it was the vision of Jesus or guilt that changed Peter's mind, but all the apocryphal sources agree that Peter turned back. This decision to return to Rome is perhaps one of the clearest signs yet that Peter had become a leader who could inspire others through his actions. But his own execution wasn't the only death he would have to contend with.